can someone be saved by kitchen creativity, and how might that affect you? That's the topic that we're going to address today on Flourish-Meant. I'm your host, Tina Yeager, and today I have a brand new guest for you. Her name is Fallon Lee. She's a member of Samaritan Ministries, and from her own personal health struggle and that of her son, she was driven to seek out healing through food, and that prompted her to write an amazing new cookbook. Welcome, Fallon. I am so thrilled to get into this amazing topic with you today.
Thank you, Tina. I'm so glad to be here. What a beautiful introduction. And I have to say, out of the gate, you have the most wonderful, calming podcast host voice. It's like music. So thank you for doing what you do, and thank you for having me today.
Oh, that warms my heart. Just like I know that what you have in your book is going to warm everybody's heart that cooks it. Let's dive right in to that topic of how you started on this journey of finding health and healing in food. That's not a place that people turn first, is it?
It's not, and it's not where I turned first either. And this will sound very boiled down. This is a decade journey in the making. And so please don't hear my story as a quick fix, because I don't believe that's what it is. But like you said, food is not where I turned first when I received a chronic illness diagnosis. I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's about 10 years ago. My second son was born in that same window and also had his own health struggles. And we did the best we could, wading through the medical system, trying to get answers. And eventually, the Lord impressed upon me that there was going to have to be a different path that we took. And so I dove headfirst into healing through food. This was a new idea to me. I thought that I was eating healthy at the time. In hindsight, I think I was eating maybe a modern definition of more along the lines of diet culture, if I look back at it. And after shifting a little bit of those parameters and really focusing in on nourishing food and not just whatever I had seen most recently in a women's magazine or some celebrity diet, I really, really dove into what foods did God create to nourish us. And once I started going down that road, it certainly wasn't linear. There were years and years of trial and error, ups and downs, healing, setbacks. But today I'm really honored to say that I'm off medication. My Hashimoto's is in remission. I don't feel like I have this limited diet. I feel immense food freedom in the things I get to cook and create and eat. And my son is a healthy, wonderful little boy. He's actively healing from food allergies. He no longer has eczema. His lungs are healing from when he was a kid. And so I'm just so incredibly honored to be pulled onto this journey, because it was certainly divine sovereignty that we even landed here. Because again, as you alluded to, many people do not turn to food. And so even that the Lord impressed this on our hearts was such a gift. And so now I love to be able to share the power of food. Is it ultimate? Absolutely not. But it's powerful, yes. And the Lord uses it to heal and restore. And so that's my mission through Fallon's Table and through everything I do. The conversations that I have is to point people to true nourishment and freedom and healing in any way I can.
How can people know whether they need to turn to traditional medicine or whether they need to seek healing through things like food and lifestyle? Can you talk about why we are so slow to move into the natural healing things, and what are some of the mistakes that we might make in moving into traditional medicine and only going there?
Absolutely. I do find in my experience that often chronic conditions fall through the cracks when it comes to Western medicine. We turn to Western medicine in our emergencies and in, often even some acute issues. But I do think when it comes to those long-standing, years of battling autoimmune, chronic illness, that it just often gets lost, and it feels like there's not often an answer. And so I do think, especially for, those women, those moms that feel like they are on this journey that they cannot get ahead of, and it feels like they've sifted through all of the resources available to them and still don't have an answer. I think we almost have to come to the end of our resources and then turn to this more holistic route in this day and age. I wish that we could do that first. But if you're like me, you had to experience what was there, what was sort of the cultural norm. And then once you realized, I don't think this is actually sustainable, then you often find yourself in this holistic world. And I was blown away at how impactful it was. And so I certainly don't want to minimize what Western medicine can and does do. It's a beautiful tool. I do think that a lot of us with those longstanding issues find ourselves wanting more than what Western traditional medicine has to offer. And we do find a lot of healing on the other side, I think. And it's a gift to be able to try to quiet some of the noise and help women streamline their journey a little bit more.
Whether we're new in suffering through some symptoms or we've done this for years, are there some signs that we can acknowledge that should point us toward natural healing and changing our diets?
I love this. I have this handful of markers that I typically turn toward that can signal we may need a little bit of extra support and help when it comes to our diet, our environment. Sleep is a big one. This is a good, big, great conversation. How is our sleep? Are we struggling with insomnia, with night wakings, with, having to use the restroom a ton during the night? These are little gentle signs that our body wants a little bit more support. We look at our skin health, our hair health, our energy, how regulated we feel, our vibrancy, our ability to handle sickness of any kind. All of these are really gentle ways that our body can point us toward possibly needing some support. And I like to phrase it in that way because what I don't want to do is encourage women to hear that, our body is being harsh or that we have to, do this big 180. But I think that our symptoms can be these really gentle messengers to say, hey, I think maybe we can shift a little bit. And so I do think there's a big conversation, a good conversation that's happening right now that a lot of the symptoms that we have just deemed normal in our modern society should not be normal. Women should be able to have fairly normal, pain-free cycles. It's kind of this narrative that we've adopted that people just have to suffer. And yes, that's true to a certain extent in this broken world. And I will stand by that. However, I think some things have become normalized that don't have to be normalized, if that makes sense.
I love that you are helping us break out of some of those cultural norms. Can you define some of the differences between what culture would point us to toward healthy eating, as you said, versus eating God's food and really experiencing the healing power of that?
Yes, I love this. I look often to ancestral principles. And sure, that looks different in different locations, different time periods. Our cultural traditions have changed, just as much as the time has changed. However, I do think we can look and see, okay, what food existed hundreds of years ago? And then what foods, or possibly even pseudo foods, exist today that we would not have found in a grocery store even 50 to 100 years ago. So we think of our ultra processed foods that, even 100 years ago, our ancestors, our great grandparents would have not known what that was, or, it didn't exist to them. And so that's my main guiding principle, is looking at what has existed, stood the test of time. I mean, we see biblically referenced foods. We see foods that have a prevalence through, again, different geographical areas certainly have their emphasis on what works best for their location and culture. But those foods that we can look back and see, okay, people had vegetable gardens and fruit trees and were raising livestock and had access to, wild caught seafood and grew their own grains. I mean, these foods have stood the test of time versus today. I think it's really easy to get sucked into this idea of, again, these ultra processed foods that wouldn't have existed about 200 years ago, even. And so that's, to me, one of my pillars, is that let's look at what has stood the test of time in terms of nourishment and let that be our guiding force.
Can we drill down into a particularly controversial food group? And that is bread. I guess it's not a food group, but it is a food that people have very strong opinions about because it's different than the bread that was eaten in biblical times. Is that really something that we should avoid? I know there's a lot of people, including me, that's gone gluten free because the breads that are available are not working for your body. Can you talk about bread a little bit?
This is a great question. All of them have been so great. I am also gluten free, but not because I have, some agenda against wheat. In certain ways, sure, I do think our wheat is a lot different than wheat was hundreds of years ago. But I think this is such a nuanced conversation that I do really enjoy having because, on one hand, we see time and time again in scripture, Jesus is referenced as the bread of life. And there's this significance of bread and flour throughout all of scripture. And so it's almost become, a joke in Christian culture these days. Like, how is Jesus the bread of life? But bread's not good for me and I can't eat it. And it does seem like there's this weird disconnect rather between, is bread good? Is bread not good? And so I think the high level things that are important to me in this conversation are that, one, our growing methods, our wheat, the prevalence of GMO foods, of things like Roundup, that has drastically changed our grains and our wheat from what it would have been hundreds of years ago. And so I think that to me presents the bigger problem than wheat does, because I don't know if you've gotten into, I think Sue Becker is her name, this idea that bread, when it's fresh milled, has all of the nutrients that we need, or a lot of the nutrients that we need. And there's this whole revolution around fresh milled flour and how nutrient rich that is. And I think it's very powerful. But when we're getting bread today, we're getting it in this plastic wrapped package that's been sitting on a store shelf for 3 weeks. And that's so much different than the bread that would have been referenced, again, say in scripture, where they're fresh milling and they have this homemade limited ingredient bread. And so, to sum up, if I'm eating bread today, I love a good sourdough. The sourdough movement is so good. I think it's great. I think homemaking bread with ingredients that that you trust. I like to prioritize our organic. I know that's not always an option for everybody, but when you can, I think making organic, homemade sourdough, or even yeasted bread can be a really good part of a nourishing diet. And it's those store-bought breads that have been sitting and have these hyper processed ingredients. I think that's where we need to raise the red flag, but I don't like to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think bread in the right way can still be a part of a nourishing diet.
As much as I think so many people that are listening and watching are encouraged to hear that maybe they can have some of that wonderful bread again, I know that you have more hope for other things in our lives in all the things that you provide in your resources. How can people stay connected with you and get a copy of your brand new Wonderful Tots cookbook?
I would love for people to come find me. I am on Instagram under Fallon Dene. I do have a website, fallonstable.com. And I'm showing up a bit more on Pinterest these days, also under Fallon Dene. And I do my best to share my heart in all of those platforms. And I will say, especially email. These days, email is really where my heart is. I like to pour out these long form helpful emails. And so if you go to my site, I would say the good stuff is on my email list for sure. But I would love for people to come find me. I try to share all the things about my journey in a really palatable and sustainable way.
I hope that all of you listening were informed and inspired to seek healing through food. And of course, I also hope that you will come back for the next episode of Flourishment.